Professor Halperin Kaddari, thank you so much for joining us. If you can, before we kind of get into the conversation, just kind of explain a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm a law professor at Bar-Ilan University in Ramat Gan, and I'm also the founding academic director of the Rachman Center for the Advancement of the Status of Women. And I have been serving for 12 years on the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It's a very long title. It's called CEDAW in short. I was also twice vice chair of the committee. And on October 7, I found myself in a very unique position of coming from the international human rights world with a lot of experience and understanding and connections, understanding that something happened that we had never experienced before. And like several others of my colleagues, I found myself understanding that we have a role here, that we have a mission to make the world know what happened, recognize and condemn, and do something, say something. And so together with several other friends and colleagues, we found the DINA project for recognition and justice for conflict-related sexual violence, or CRSV as we call it, the acronyms. And that's what we've been doing for the past 2 years.
Can I take it back before October 7th? When you were involved in this work prior to the war beginning, did you see a sort of dismissal as we kind of see it today? Or was October 7th kind of a pivotal moment in that dismissal of, listening to victims and hearing their testimonies?
It was definitely a pivotal moment. I can clearly say that during all the years that I was part of that committee, the mantra of believe women and believe all women was very much followed. This is not to say that whenever something happened, there was an immediate response. UN bodies usually do take some time to wait to hear a little more, or urge to conduct investigations and inquiries, but they would have reacted. And that's what I expected. I immediately emailed my former colleagues on the UN committee and UN Women and the special rapporteur on violence against women. I emailed them on October 8 and 9, and I waited for them to say something, and they didn't. UN Women reacted and uttered the words sexual violence and expressed concerns of reports about sexual violence only 58 days after October 7. And that's much, much longer than anywhere else in the world.
So let's talk about the DINA project then. What was the process like starting the project? What did you discover? Obviously, it's probably very difficult content, and feel free to share, what you're comfortable with sharing. But how did it look? How did you piece the pieces together?
So I should first say that we are now 5 members of the DINA project. My 2 co-authors of the book, which I'll talk in a moment, are former Judge Nava Ben-Or, who had formerly been the Assistant Attorney General in charge of criminal affairs, and former Colonel Sharon Zagagi Pinchas in reserve, who is now the director of the DINA project. She had previously been the chief military prosecutor. And then we also have Nurit Jacobs-Yinon, who is responsible for all the visual of our project, of our website, and of the book, the art director of the project, and Ita Prince-Gibson, who's a freelance journalist. And most of our work had been dedicated to putting together all the pieces of the puzzle, as we call it, from all the open sources. I think that we spent hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of very, very carefully scrutinizing and cross reports, fact-checking every piece of information. Added to that also some information that is not publicly available from IDF sources, the intelligence, or from the police. And we weighed each piece of information according to its evidentiary value. So we are jurists, we are legal professionals, and we employed our experience in the legal realm to build together a very, very solid factual infrastructure that allowed us to get to the bottom lines and say that there are 17 eyewitnesses or ear witnesses in real time that were actually there on October 7 or in captivity and saw in their own eyes or heard in their own ears the cases, the incidents of rape, of gang rape, of mutilation, of rapes that ended in execution. And even though there are no first-hand witnesses that are able to speak about the sexual violence that they endured on October 7, for the very tragic reason that most of them had been killed immediately after or sometimes during the sexual assault itself, and those that survived are too traumatized to speak. So, notwithstanding the fact that there are no first-hand witnesses, this circle, again, which we could conduct based on our experience of weighing the evidence, is a conclusive one that should be accorded the same value as a first-hand testimony of victims. And then we obviously have the first-hand testimonies of the returned hostages. And from our perspective, the sexual violence that continued in captivity, about which we have no doubt, and there also we can show a pattern. This demonstrates, this adds to the conclusion that the sexual violence was systematic. There were patterns going through all those cases to which the first-hand witnesses testify of. And there is a pattern going through all the footage and the images that the first responders took, and from which we, based on also previous reports, such as that of the Under Secretary General of the UN, Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Pramila Patten, who conducted a fact-finding mission in January and February of last year of 2024 and published her report in March of 24, concluded that there was reasonable ground to believe that rape and gang rape occurred in at least 3 different locations, and that there was a pattern of bodies found either fully naked or partially naked in positions that left no doubt as to what took place prior to their being killed. So all this came together to base the conclusion that sexual violence was used as a weapon of war in a systematic, widespread manner on October 7 and in captivity. And this conclusion is now actually based in the Secretary General's annual report for 2024, where he added Hamas to the blacklist of those organizations who indeed use sexual violence as a weapon of war. And this is something that again, it's one of our aims. You know, we have the goal of recognition and justice. This is recognition. This is the recognition by the highest international authority about what Hamas really is. An organization that uses rape, that uses sexual violence as a weapon of war. They're not resistance fighters. They're not freedom fighters. They are rapists, just like Daesh, like Boko Haram. Now, the second part of our work is to advance the justice, to end impunity, to achieve
what to
achieve accountability. It means that the perpetrators of sexual violence in war, in conflict, they cannot just walk away and be immune against they have to be prosecuted for the rapes, for the sexual violence. Now, it's a problem because...
how do you identify those people?
Exactly.
The people that tragically, and I think that's the part that kind of hit me the most when you were talking just now, is that the reason why we don't have these first-hand testimonies a lot of the time is that when people were raped or had some sort of sexual violence towards them, they ended up being killed or executed afterwards. And I mean, that is just the silence of it is so tragic, because in a way, you, and with your project, you are those people's voices. And I can't imagine also the responsibility that must feel like. But I'm wondering, in the sense of, you know, people who still, again, like we see it in the news a lot. We're at the Jerusalem Post right now. We see that continuously there are reports coming out that are anti what you're saying right now. They try to disprove the fact that there was sexual violence. What do you say, especially as somebody who has been firsthand part of the, you know, the investigation and really seeing what happened? What do you say when you see those things?
So first of all, I just want to build on the point where you said that in some sense we are the voice of those who were silenced forever. This is why we picked the name Dinah. You know, it's Yaakov's daughter. We just read the portion last week, Parashat Vayishlach, where the story of her rape by Hamor ben Shechem is told, and you probably notice that she has no voice. She does not speak throughout the story. And this is, of course, very symbolic that those victims had been silenced forever, and we took it upon ourselves to speak for them. And you are very, very right to point out to the biggest challenge in trying to achieve accountability and justice in these cases when there are no victims or no victims who are able to speak. And that's why we are providing a framework, an evidentiary framework, and a legal framework that says, yes, you do not have the first-hand testimony of the victim, and you probably cannot identify the victim, but you have all those other circles of evidence, including those first-hand eyewitnesses, ear witnesses who themselves are survivors. You have all other evidence, the footage, the photos, and you have to hold all those who entered the fence on the morning of October 7, after being indoctrinated with a genocidal ideology based on Hamas charter, being trained in camps that will brainwash them in such hatred and with such ideology of intending to completely exterminate the Israeli nation and the Jewish people in Israel from the face of earth. So they entered this attack and they joined this attack, this massacre, with this intention, knowing that they would employ anything and everything possible. And that's what they did. So they should all be held accountable. We are basing this theory on a very well-established doctrine of joint responsibility in criminal law or joint criminal enterprise in international criminal law. So we're not inventing anything new. We are just using that for the specific case, the specific phenomena of using sexual violence as a weapon of war. When you cannot identify the specific perpetrator, and you cannot identify the specific victim, you cannot show the connection between them. You don't even have the traditional forensic evidence because it was a war zone, and the bodies
were burned.
Exactly. They were burned, and the first task of all those workers in the morgue, in the Shura military base, was just to identify them and bring them to swift burial according to Jewish tradition. So they were buried with the evidence.
I want to ask you a deliberate question now, and I know what you're going to answer, but it's important because I want this to be, if people take something from this interview, I want it to be this. If I were to ask you, and I will ask you, is there evidence of sexual violence on October 7th? Your answer would be?
Definitely yes.
Why do you think people are denying it? What kind of gain do they get? After you're saying, I've seen it with my own eyes, the evidence that is there, why are people turning their eye away?
It's a combination of reasons. I think that also have to separate between who are the deniers, right? There are those who are supporters of Hamas, who will always just follow the mantra of Hamas. Then there are those women's organizations, feminist organizations, or other groups on the global left, as we sometimes call them, very, very disappointingly, demonstrated their total inability to hold a nuanced situation. And they are unable to get away from their entrenched thought boxes of seeing Israel as the ultimate villain and the Palestinians as the ultimate victim, and also being, confused with always putting Israel on the colonialist side, and Palestinians as the victims of colonialization. And they're just unable to see that, at least on that day of October 7, the equation had actually flipped around. And Israeli innocent men and women and children and the elderly were victimized in the most horrible fashion, but by those who purport to be freedom fighters and resistance fighters. So they are unable to hold these two truths together. And so conveniently, they simply say it didn't happen because they need to continue idolizing those purportedly freedom fighters. And then there are all those United Nations entities and organizations. And here you really have to differentiate. There are those who did do their work as they should, impartially, and stuck to the truth and looked at both sides, but were courageous enough to show their findings, such as the Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Pramila Patten, such as the Special Rapporteur on Torture, Dr. Alice Edwards, such as the Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Killings, Mr. Maurice Tidball, even the COI, the Commission of Inquiry, in their June 24 report, they were honest enough to say that they found evidence for the sexual violence to have taken place on at least 6 different locations on October 7, including rapes, and they attributed the sexual violence to Hamas. So there are those, and then there are those who completely betrayed their mandate and their role and their responsibility in promoting and protecting human rights and women's rights for all women everywhere, such as UN Women. They not only failed us in Israel or Jewish people or Jewish women, they failed their whole mission. They failed all of humanity in not being honest in their work.
I'd like to say as well, not that I don't recommend people to do this, but what's interesting is that, things are very, very documented. As, somebody who works in journalism, there's been times where I've come across the footage from October 7th and it's almost undeniable, even without doing the sort of deeper investigations. There are ways for people to look this up and say, this has happened. I think people sometimes choose not to. And I don't even think I would recommend people looking. It's scarring, it's difficult. But the evidence is there, it's out there. I think people need to ask more questions. Why? If this didn't happen, then why would this exist? Why would this situation be like this? And I really want to encourage whoever might be listening to this and, you know, is kind of on the fence and they don't know what's true and what's not. There are ways to look things up, and like, you know, there are ways to look also in the Dina Project, I'm sure, to have more of, instead of it being, you know, a something that's feelings based, which a lot of this is because it is so tragic. Facts are there. They're there. You can see them. You can see the documentation. And I think that's part of what's so important about what you're doing. I want to move on a little bit and ask you also about, it's the Rachman Institute, right?
The Rachman Center.
I'm going to ask again, Center. Okay, so I want to move on and ask you about the Rachman Center, because I know that's also a big part of your work.
Yes, it is. So I'm kind of wearing several hats, which is not unusual for me. The Rachman Center has actually found itself needing to expand to do this new frontier of justice for women in Israel that opened up after October 7, but all other frontiers in which we are so involved, and we have been for the past 25 years. The Rachman Center was established more than 25 years ago. All these other frontiers are very, very much in need now. We are in a very bad era for women in Israel. Women in Israel are really facing threats that we had not faced before. The like threats of growing violence against women, more weapons on the streets. We had reached a record of more than 40 women already killed this past year, 34 of whom were victims of domestic violence, and many of them were killed with weapons that unfortunately proliferated after October 7. The licenses to get weapons were very much eased under the instructions of the Minister for Internal Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir. We are facing a shrinking presence of women in decision-making positions, in leadership positions, 0 director generals in governmental ministries, compared to more than 10 female director generals in the government that preceded this current government. We are witnessing the expansion of the jurisdiction of rabbinical courts, which, as we all know, people find it natural, do not have women as judges in the rabbinical courts. So there's, if you're looking for exclusion of women, that's where it started. And now this jurisdiction is just going to have more powers and be almost a parallel system to the civil court system. And we are not seeing any improvement in the wage gaps between men and women. On the contrary, so everything is really in a regression. And this government, I say it, and I stand behind what I'm saying. This government has actually declared a war against women in Israel. And when you see the parliament, the Knesset, devoting its time to a session, to conduct a meeting, to discuss the value of virginity before marriage for non-religious women, you ask yourself, what are the priorities of this government that actually controls the parliament? As we are in the midst of regression in our democratic system. So this is all part of the of what we are experiencing in Israel, and we see it in so many countries. It's a common phenomena for backsliding democracies where women and women's rights are the first to be affected.
How does the Rachman Center then try to combat these issues? Because they seem quite big. It doesn't seem, like it's an easy thing to tackle.
So first of all, of course, we are not alone. And we partner with other organizations, with the Women's Rights Network, with other women's rights organizations. And we have several departments in our center. We have a legal aid program, which operates a legal aid clinic, which is basically like a law firm, like a law office, with 4 full-time lawyers who provide pro bono legal representation for women in divorce proceedings, in family proceedings, in all courts, whether it is the religious courts or the family courts, and going up to the High Court of Justice or the Supreme Court. And then next to that, we have an advocacy department, policy and advocacy. So where we keep, we are kind of a watchdog on everything that takes place in relation to women's situation, primarily in family law and related to domestic violence or to religion and state and how it affects women, where we bring our own initiatives or what we find ourselves more and more in recent years, pushing back against the shrinking and against the attempts to decrease women's rights. So we are in the parliament, we are in the Knesset almost every day when there are discussions of these laws, and now it actually happens every day. And we are also trying to advance our own initiatives, such as the definition of domestic violence. There is no definition of domestic violence in Israeli law. And when something is not defined, is not legally defined, you cannot really tackle it.
Like, how do you get justice if you can't then say this is what it was?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And so many law enforcement officers, including judges, still maintain the traditional notion that domestic violence is only physical violence. And verbal, emotional, economic, or the most prevalent form, which is coercive control, which is like non-physical but terrorization and total control over the partner, this is not considered domestic violence. But this is the work that we're doing. We are providing a definition. We have constructed a bill, and we try to find the representative in the parliament to table this bill, which we did, and we hope to be able to advance it even within this very uncooperative regime.
And finally, I think we would be amiss kind of not to mention that not only, in Israel right now, there are dire situations for women in many different countries, even in Western countries, but I'm looking more at, where war is more prevalent. We have Sudan, obviously Afghanistan, Iran. How do you find this work has an impact, globally? Does it?
During all my years in the international women's rights world, in the CEDAW committee, I was there, in fact, not as a representative of Israel. I was there as an independent expert working for the protection and the advancement and the promotion of women's rights globally throughout the world. And I do believe that that kind of work has a value and has some effect. Or maybe I'll phrase it differently.
Sure.
If there hadn't been those bodies such as the CEDAW or other human rights committees, international human rights committees, the situation would have been worse. So, of course, it's very frustrating to see those places where it seems that nothing can help, where only force and might speak. I cry when I read about women in Afghanistan and women in Iran and women in DRC and Congo. So it's terrible. And yet I do believe that those international human rights frameworks have value. Now, the work, the specific work that we are doing at the DINA project, while developing the legal thesis that shows how justice can and must be done, even faced with those challenges, those evidentiary and legal challenges for accountability for conflict-related sexual violence, this definitely has value for other cases of weaponization of rape beyond October 7. And that is why we titled our book, A Quest for Justice, October 7 and Beyond.
Well, I want to thank you so much for your time and also for the work that you're doing, again, and being a voice for those who aren't able to speak. So thank you for being on the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.